joining us is Mr. Austin Erame, who is the Program Officer, Democratic Governance at CISLAC. You're welcome to Sunrise Daily.
Thank you, Mark.
And joining us also is Mr. Eric Ifere, who is the Member, National Prosecution Coordinating Committee. Welcome to Sunrise Daily.
Thanks so much for having me here.
Yeah, thank you for coming, gentlemen. Just wondering, what were your thoughts yesterday? I mean, after this report was officially released here in Nigeria, we're talking about perception. You know, is perception the same thing with reality? People perceive what people perceive. Is it the same thing as the reality on the ground?
Okay, do I shoot first?
Yes, please,
okay.
By all means.
Yeah. So we want to believe that yes, the index has released the CPI is a perception, but however, we've seen cases where perception largely informs reality. And why I say this, for instance, is the realization that in most instances, when such reports or indices are being released across the globe, it actually informs the way the international community takes us. And I am also aware of countries and institutions that actually use such reports to inform their business investments and decisions in countries. For instance, there are countries and institutions that do not go into investment opportunities in countries that fall below certain thresholds on the CPI index. So yeah, it's a perception, but it's something that we must take very seriously because perception, like I said, informs reality.
What's your take on that?
Well, to me, it's not a very accepted in terms of the fact that looking at the perception and the figures that it shows, the whole exercise is very flawed. Statistically, it is flawed. Definition-wise, it is very biased, and the consistency in the figures showed over time would show you that not much is put into finding out what the figures are really are. Take, for instance, those who roll out these figures are just about 13 so-called experts. You know, groups are so-called experts.
So-called?
Yes, so-called experts.
I think it's important that you address them with some amount of respect. Let us not forget that in times past, this same, the government has also embraced, and there are people who have embraced the ratings when they go up. So is it because we're down now, then, you know, the experts are so-called?
No, let's get it right. We're not too down. What have they come up with? 28 over 100. Last year, it was 27 over 100. The other year, it was 26 over. You could see the consistency. Sometimes I wonder if, looking at demographical listing of this country, if they really perform some good survey. This survey is based on why I call them so-called experts. These are experts who are outside Nigeria and then made up of 13 groups of these surveys. How did they conduct these surveys? How many people were spoken to? How did they get these figures? How could they measure how much corruption is in a wide country of almost 2 million? How did they arrive at these figures?
Well, I think what is clear from the analysis is that this is not a simple matter of evaluating quote-unquote tangible corruption, or if you want to call it looting, or if you want to call it a fiscal misappropriation, that it's more comprehensive in that it covers other aspects of what it is to be corrupt. That includes nepotism, that includes the delayed dispensation of justice or non-dispensation of justice. So all these factors combined, understanding that, would you still stand on the idea that this corruption perception index is completely flawed?
Yes, I do. Let me say something here. You see, Transparency International has a very narrow definition of what corruption is. And particularly, it does emphasize corruption in terms of bribery and corruption.
That's just one aspect.
Yes, but it does emphasize. So when you talk about nepotism, how do you measure the number of incidents of nepotism that occur in a particular country? How do you arrive at that? How will you arrive at that? It's so difficult. So it's neither here nor there. And I quite see.
While you question their methods, I find it quite interesting that last year, you know, it was embraced. I mean, in many quarters, that this was a sign of, you know, the government's progress in the fight against corruption. But then, maybe you want to speak a bit more to the methods employed by Transparency International.
Yeah, in terms of the methodology, I mean, this CPI has been released consistently since 1995. And like we rightly agree, years where this CPI actually favor us as a country, we embrace the CPI. But in the years that the CPI do not really favor us as a country, we tend to want to dismiss it. And I think it is this kind of reception that we should be quick to guide against. Now, for instance, I tell you very importantly, corruption, the CPI focuses on corruption in public administration. So it does not look at private sector. That's the first point to make. Secondly, and very importantly, is that while you have the scoring on one hand, you also have the ranking on the other hand. So if, for instance, Nigeria slipped one spot from the 28th position to the 27th position, in terms of the country ranking, you then see that we've slipped 12 positions. And what it means is that there are countries across the world, because I mean the CPI assessed 180 countries in 2017. So what it then means is that there are countries across the world that are increasingly becoming very aware that corruption is a menace that must be addressed, and they are putting in structures to address that menace. So in terms of the methodology still, you have, for instance, in Nigeria, 9 institutions, and I wouldn't want to say that they are so-called, because I want to take complete exception to that they are so-called. These are proven institutions that have made their mark very renowned over time. You have the World Bank Group, for instance. You have the African Development Bank, for instance. You have the Economic Intelligence Units that also churn out this data. Now, what the methodology does is that from all of these sources, it actually lumps all of them and does some analysis. It's a composite index. It does some analysis to come out with the index. So it's not like one institution sitting back to picking up on any particular country. So at the end of the day, it doesn't make much good to us as a people to just any time that the CPI doesn't favor us, we then reject it. It is something we must take very seriously, especially in the light of the fact that the current ticket was won largely on this anti-corruption stance.
You know, in fairness to the contrarian view, Mr. Ereme, some people have said, look, if you look at the rankings of Nigeria in the TI CPI over the last 5 years, you see that one of the highest scores, in fact, the highest score came in 2014, when you had, as we now know, you had Dasuki Gate, you had numerous scandals swirling around the oil minister at that time, Desiani. You had so many things going on in 2014 ahead of the elections. And people have said, well, look, if this is an accurate indicator of corruption within the country, why would that have been our best ranking over the last 5 years during that year? What are your thoughts on that?
So my take on that would be that, look, over time, in as much as, like we said, these are perceptions. But however, these are the perception flows from people that do business with the country. So in as much as during the best rankings came out within that era, those perceptions must have still been informed by the manner in which those that have been doing business with the multinationals or state institutions in the country were able to interact with the country, and their perceptions on how those institutions were also able to respond to checking the excesses. Yes, those cases emanated in those periods, but however, moving beyond that era whereby we had those the quote and unquote fairly good ratings on the CPI, you want to also agree that we've not really made considerable amount of progress going forward right now, because what we've seen very recently is a situation whereby majority of reports still come out in terms of corruption cases, And when we talk about corruption cases like the statement which we released yesterday, we're talking about grant corruption. It's just beyond bribery now, for instance. We're looking at the entire aspect of what corruption is being defined as. So we tend to want to believe that, yes, those era, like I said, were instances whereby there was some fair amount of progress on the CPI index, but going forward, not much progress has been made. We still have issues that talks about, I mean, everybody said that we're recovering monies, we're recovering assets, but how effective has that process been?